So hello there, welcome to this Making of America revision video. This revision video is going to focus on topic 5, which is American cultures, 1877 to 1900. In this revision video, we're going to look at changes to the Plains Indians' way of life, including the impact of reservations and the destruction of the buffalo. We're going to talk about the impact of economic, social and political change on the lives of African Americans, and we're going to look at the growth of big business cities and mass migration. So just a reminder of where this fits in. American cultures is the last topic. It goes from 1877 to 1900 and concludes the Making of America course. Just a reminder about how you'll be assessed on Making of America. Same style of questions as you get for People's Health. 3 gateway questions. Question 2 is write a clear and organised summary, where you need to be able to link that really clearly to one or more second order concepts. 2 clear paragraphs. Question 3 is a cause or consequence question. Again, 2 key paragraphs. And then question 4 or 5, got a choice for that question. It's your 18-mark question. You need 4 key arguments, a degree of balance, and a conclusion with a clinching argument. Okay, so let's find out about the changing lives of Plains Indians. So in the last revision video, we found out about how many Native Americans their lives on the plains were changed as a result of the migration of white Americans, such as creating things like the cow towns, for example, the cattle ranches. We also found out about the homesteaders, and we also found out about Transcontinental Railroad, and we found out how that subsequently led to the Native American Wars. And the last thing we're looking at was the Battle of Little Bighorn. So in the years after 1877, American cultures were very much shaped. Chicago became a huge city in the West, and in 1892, 400 years since Christopher Columbus landed in North America, work began on the World's Fair, which was held there in 1893. Now, the World's Fair was a showcase of American technology. It took place in 1893 in Chicago. Chicago had grand architecture, wide streets, towering buildings. It was very much a powerful image of American success during this time. Now, the United States on display during this time period did not and does not reflect all Americans. Black Americans were not allowed to take part and were not represented, and Native Americans were also poorly represented as well. So it very much helps us to kind of very much focus on the idea that white Americans during this time period have kind of forced their kind of culture and their way of life at the expense of Black Americans and Native Americans in America during this time period. So after 1877, US government policies became much harsher. Many Native Americans were forced to move to reservations. The Native American people were made to adopt white ways of life. The ghost dance movement was the last attempt by Plains Native Americans to resist in the 19th century. Now, in terms of the consequence of the Great Sioux War and the Battle of Little Bighorn, many Plains tribes were forced onto US government reservations. Native American groups were split up to prevent them from fighting back. The government did not put a lot of money into reservations, such as the Standing Rock Reservation, for example. Supplies, medical aid, food rations were often very low. There was also a huge consequence in terms of the destruction of the buffalo, which was obviously integral to the way of life of Native Americans living on the plains. The growth of the railroad network brought many hunters to the plains to shoot and kill buffalo, and as many as 3 million buffalo were killed by 1883. The government did little to stop the slaughter, and the vast herds of buffalo were destroyed. The arrival of homesteaders, ranchers, and big businesses on the plains pushed many tribes to starvation, and again the government did almost nothing to stop this. Now, Sitting Bull and a band of followers escaped to Canada, but returned in 1881, starved of food, and surrendered to the US Army. Okay, so one of the ways in which the lives of Native Americans from the plains changed quite a lot after 1877 was because it became official reservation policy to force Native Americans on the plains to give up their own cultures. So you need to be able to have some examples of that attempt to destroy Native American culture on the reservations. So the first thing is that the US government took control of Native American courts and made Native Americans set up government structures like in the USA. Ranchers fenced off areas where the Pueblo peoples drove their sheep herds. Homesteaders in the Central Plains fenced in water supplies, which made it really difficult for Native Americans to live on the plains. Native Americans were encouraged to live in houses instead of teepees. Native American tribes were split up and sent to different reservations. Big factories paid people to pick wild foods such as berries, so that big business encroached upon the lives of Native American people on the plains. This deprived nomadic tribes of important food supplies. Native Americans were forced to convert to Christianity. The destruction of the buffalo made many traditional Native American beliefs impossible. And in fact, the attack on their way of life made many of their traditional Native American beliefs impossible as well. Many Native American children were educated in Christian boarding schools, which were kept away from the reservations. Native American children were made to choose English names. Children who did not speak English at school were often beaten. In history lessons, Native American children were taught how Plains Native Americans had attacked and killed innocent white settlers. Okay, so another way in which the lives of Native Americans on the Plains was changed was to do with the actions of a group that was set up called the Friends of the Indian. Now, the Friends of the Indian was a movement that was set up in 1883 to help protect the rights of Native Americans, but their actions often led to further assimilation and often contributed to the destruction of Native American cultures. So some of the actions that they took, many government agents who ran the reservations were corrupt. So the Friends of the Indian reported corrupt agents and monitored how money on the reservations was spent. Many Native American children had no real formal education, so the Friends of the Indian helped Native American children learn English so they could access jobs in white America, but that also led to further assimilation and a further erosion of Native American culture. Many Native Americans were not full citizens of the USA, which meant they had no rights and could not vote. So the Friends of the Indian persuaded the government to pass the Dawes Act of 1887. This gave each Native American family 160 acres and citizenship if they gave up their claim to tribal lands. However, although the ideas were well-meaning, the Dawes Act further eroded Native American culture and meant many Native Americans lost lots of land. By 1900, nearly 2/3 of the land held by Native Americans in 1877 had been taken over by white settlers. So the Dawes Act was a key event in bringing about further erosion of Native American culture. Okay, so one of the last attempts at resistance by Plains tribes in the 19th century was what was called the Ghost Dance Movement. Now, during the 1890s, a new religious movement called the Ghost Dance Movement sprang up on the reservations. It was led by a holy man named Wovoka. The ghost dancers believed that if they danced and prayed, the white settlers would be swept off the land and the buffalo would return. This led to concern among white Americans living near the reservations, and there were rumours that Sitting Bull was going to join the movement. In 1890, the government sent in the army to stop the ghost dance movement and arrest them. Sioux police were told to arrest Sitting Bull, and he was dragged out of his cabin in the snow and shot through the head. Many of the ghost dancers ran away to Dakota, and the ghost dancers were eventually tracked down at a place called Wounded Knee. The army opened fire and killed over 250 men, women and children, despite the Native Americans being largely defenceless. On the 15th of January 1891, over 4,000 ghost dancers surrendered. It was the last Native American attempt at resistance in the 19th century. Okay, so the next part of this topic is to look at the changing lives of Black Americans between 1877 and 1900. So Black Americans continued to live in poverty after the end of Reconstruction. So America's economic development between 1877 and 1900 did create opportunities for some Black Americans, but the majority continued to live in poverty and faced discrimination. The freedoms of the Reconstruction era were being eroded. In the 1890s, civil rights campaigners such as Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells campaigned for the rights of black people. So just have a look at Ida B. Wells in a bit more depth and detail as a case study. Ida B. Wells was born as an enslaved person in 1862 and got an education thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau. She became a teacher and moved to Tennessee. She sued a train company in 1884 when the train crew ordered her to move to a carriage for Black Americans, and her case was overturned by the highest court in Tennessee. As a journalist, she travelled across the US and raised awareness about poor treatment of Black Americans, including quality of education and lynchings. Ida B. Wells became a founding member of the NAACP in 1909, which was a pressure group that campaigned for the rights of African American people, black people in America in the late 19th and 20th century. Okay, so Black Americans continued to live in poverty after the end of the Reconstruction era. In the South, the cotton industry collapsed after the American Civil War, with European nations getting supplies from elsewhere. Black Americans were generally prevented from getting better paid jobs. The majority of Black Americans in the South worked as sharecroppers on land that had been owned by slaveholders. The Southern economy was largely propped up by money from Northern-owned railroads. In terms of opportunities in the West, the Homestead Act was open to black Americans. In 1877, Benjamin Singleton tried to encourage ex-slaves to move to Kansas and claim land under the Homestead Act. By 1879, over 6,000 black Americans had moved to Kansas. By 1880, this had doubled to 15,000 black citizens, and they became known as the Exodusters. In terms of challenges in the North, between 1887 and 1900, many black Americans left the South for northern cities to look for work. Due to racism, black workers were much less likely to get a job than white workers, even if they were more qualified. Businesses sometimes used black workers to break strikes, which led to increased tensions. In terms of education, Booker T. Washington set up a school to train black children to be farmers, craftsmen and house servants. Some people criticised this approach as not being ambitious enough for black Americans and targeting more low-skilled jobs than the sort of higher-skilled jobs. In 1900, Washington established an organisation called the Negro Business League to support black businesses, and by 1900 there were 23,866 black teachers, 417 black doctors and 300 black lawyers in the USA. So in the South of America, Jim Crow laws, which were laws that kept black people and white people segregated, they kept living conditions poor for black Americans. The laws had the effect of segregating black and white people in America. Land ownership among black Americans increased from 1877 to 1900. However, housing continued to be really poor. In cities, most black Americans had to live in black-only areas, whether they were in the North or the South. By 1900, most black workers in the North lived in 90% black areas with terrible housing. Jim Crow laws were introduced in the 1890s in many southern states. Jim Crow laws introduced segregation in many southern states. Jim Crow laws covered everything from separate seating in trains and theatres to completely separate churches, parks and schools. In 1896, the Supreme Court agreed that providing separate facilities for black and white people was legal. This was known as the Plessy versus Ferguson case and established the principle of separate but equal. Despite the Jim Crow laws, black churches became more important in the lives of ordinary black Americans. They helped to build a sense of community and identity. By 1900, there were 26 black bishops, and many preachers were unwilling, however, to challenge Jim Crow laws. There was a growth in published output from black scholars. Over 100 books and 206 journals were published by black authors between 1865 and 1893. An example is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was part of an educated northern black elite. He was a history and economics professor at Atlanta University. Okay, so political violence against black Americans also increased after 1877, and this was due to the Ku Klux Klan and some other factors as well. So one factor was the Redeemers. Many southern state governments were run by ex-slaveholders, and these governments called themselves Redeemer governments, and they tried to undo the changes made after the Civil War and Reconstruction. Redeemer governments brought in literacy tests to stop black Americans from voting, they introduced segregation laws, and they ignored violence against black Americans. For example, in Louisiana in 1896, 130,333 black people registered to vote, but by 1905 it was just 1,342. The Ku Klux Klan were a violent group who believed that black Americans were inferior to whites. The KKK was banned in the 1870s but reformed secretly by the 1890s. The KKK was a racist group, and it had a lot of influence among people in power, including state politicians and the Southern police forces. And the KKK believed the South could have won the Civil War. There were constitutional changes. Black Americans continued to campaign for better treatment because the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments still existed and promised them equality, citizenship and voting rights. But wherever the South did, it could not make black Americans slaves again or remove their right to vote altogether. But lots of constitutional verdicts like Plessy versus Ferguson that we just talked about eroded those constitutional rights. And then lynching. One way in which black Americans were kept in fear was through lynching, and lynching is hanging someone without a proper trial. In 1892, 161 black Americans were lynched by white mobs, mainly in the South, and hardly any of the people responsible were arrested. Okay, so our last topic to look at is the growth of big business, cities and mass migration from 1877 to 1900. So during this time, cities grew massively and that created new opportunities. They often contained poor areas too. A good example of a big business case study is in 1848, 13-year-old Andrew Carnegie emigrated to America from Scotland, and in 1901, at the age of 66, he had formed the United States Steel Corporation, worth over $1 billion. He made his money through investment in railroads, allowing him to buy a steel plant in Pittsburgh, which became the source of his wealth. And during the last years of his life, he actually gave most of his fortune away. Now, workers during this time formed trade unions to protect their rights. In 1892, a dispute over pay led to a strike at Carnegie's Steel Company. In 1893, the Pullman Railroad Car Company cut the wages of its workers in Chicago, causing 260,000 workers to go on strike. The president sent troops to break the strike, violence broke out, and 26 workers were shot. Now, between 1877 and 1900, we saw huge businesses run by a president and board of shareholders rather than one person. The early examples of those big corporations tended to be the railroad companies. And between 1850 and 1900, 5,300 manufacturing firms in the USA had been absorbed into 334 corporations. So very much the story we have is a big business and lots of these huge companies which had a lot of influence. Now, this focus on big business created opportunities. So in terms of industry, the number of cotton mills in the South doubled between 1880 and 1900. The southern states could now support their own cotton growing industry with a major producer of cotton cloth. The American Tobacco Company controlled 90% of cigarette production and 75% of tobacco production. But in terms of impact on people, more cotton factories meant more demand for cotton. Cotton was usually picked by poorly paid black Americans or sharecroppers. New factories created jobs, but these were very low paid and low skilled and usually for white workers. The American Tobacco Company controlled nearly all production. This meant there was no reason to improve wages or working conditions for workers. The other challenges that big businesses brought in terms of industry, there were lots of farms and ranches, so small scale farming on the plains died. So remember, we have been learning about the homesteaders in the 1860s and 1870s, and these huge bonanza farms, which are farms over 10,000 acres and employing 250 workers, and ranches began to appear in the 1880s. Bonanza ranches developed by 1886, and the oversupply of cattle meant beef prices fell, whilst a harsh winter in 1886-1887 killed millions of cattle. This led to the collapse of smaller ranches. By 1900, most farms and ranches in the West were owned by just a handful of people, often by Eastern capitalists. So in terms of the impact on people could not afford their own land, they couldn't get employment on a farm or ranch, and they couldn't save to buy their own land. Bonanza farms tended to control the best land, the water, the railroads, and stopped smaller farms from competing. Bonanza ranches sometimes used violence to intimidate small-scale ranchers. Black and minority farmers could not usually compete with the bonanza farmers, and environmental damage meant that the limited water was used up, forcing many Native Americans onto reservations. Other industries, minerals. The growth of the railroads led to a huge demand for coal, iron, steel, and other minerals such as oil. The government passed a law in 1872 allowing companies to set up mines more easily. Coal production in the South increased tenfold between 1875 and 1890, and discoveries of copper, tin, lead, and silver brought new companies to the West. Resources like copper and silver were used in cables for electricity. In terms of impact on people, big corporations and companies used their power and political influence to pay workers as little as possible. When steel workers went on strike in 1892, the local militia was sent in and 6 strikers were killed. Black and Mexican workers were employed by companies when white workers went on strike. Trade unions, which are organisations set up to protect workers' rights, had little power and usually used this power to stop black or Mexican workers from getting employment. And big companies could blacklist troublesome employees and stop them from getting other work. And that created new opportunities. So in 1870 there were 14 cities with more than 100,000 people in the USA, but by 1900 there were 38. Chicago grew from a town of 200 to a city of 300,000. By 1870, cities controlled local water supplies and used these to increase their own power. Cities attracted people, especially in the American West, where access to water was a key part of surviving. Now, during the 1880s, the invention of the elevator and the skyscraper led to cities building even taller buildings. They held the promise of America's riches, but many were left disappointed. Cities were very overcrowded. It was not uncommon for 32 families to share a 6 or 8 story tenement apartment building. Overcrowding led to disease. In Chicago, for example, 60% of babies died before the age of 1. Cities also drew people in with promises of work, entertainment, education and freedom. Women and black Americans gained some benefits from city life. Western cities were a driving force eventually behind women getting the vote in America in the 1920s. So in the late 19th century, immigration continued to grow. Statue of Liberty in New York is a potent symbol of that immigration. Immigrants often, however, unfortunately met with racism and hostility when they arrived. Now, many migrants were inspired by the idea of the American dream, represented in events like the Chicago World Fair, and the idea that if people worked hard, then they could achieve anything they wanted to. So lots of people came to America for the booming economy. By the 1880s, travel to America was faster and cheaper thanks to the steamships. Jews and other minority groups were being persecuted in European places like Russia, for example, where there were pogroms. America offered freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, so many people came to America to start new lives. Now, when people arrived in America, 600,000 immigrants came from Italy in the 1890s. The US government had left immigration rules up to state, but in the 1890s they began to control it more. Now, Ellis Island in New York opened in 1892 to process immigrants. Immigrants would travel from Ellis Island to New York via ferry. Immigrants had to pass a basic language test and a medical examination. In terms of living in America, most immigrants went to cities to find work. Anti-immigrant violence was common. The American Protective Association was set up to protect Protestant Americans from Catholics, Jews and Buddhist immigrants. Laws prevented Chinese workers from moving freely in California through the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese people made up 10% of the population of San Francisco but could not leave an area known as Chinatown. And immigrants often ended up in the poorest areas of cities. So that includes the final topic of Making of America. Hope you enjoyed that and learned something from that. Thanks very much for listening. Bye bye.